Okay, now that you've taken a look at the annotated Constitution, we can get back into Marshall's arguments around Congress having the power to create a bank. So, uh, even though the word bank isn't directly authorized, because a bank is so necessary for helping to regulate commerce and control the money supply, so on and so forth, that's a good reason to think that it is something that the Constitution allows. And another argument that Marshall makes is, well, wait a second. If we're supposed to have this like strict construction thing about like we had under the Articles of Confederation, not only is there no instructions to say that you should have a strict construction of how many powers Congress has, but the Constitution goes a step further. It says Congress shall not have the powers listed in Article 1, Section 9. And guess what isn't there either? The word bank. Okay, so Marshall is a big believer in structuralism. And you're going to see structuralist arguments all over the place. Now, I know some of these might seem a little abstract, so please, if you have any questions, pause the video, use the annotation feature, because understanding Marshall and structuralism is a really important goal of this class. Okay, so here's where Marshall starts. He says that the Constitution, that it's a good thing that it's relatively short. And by the way, if you look at constitutions across the world, the U.S. Constitution is amongst the very shortest. And even if you look at American state constitutions, every single state constitution except for one is longer than the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is fairly unique in being so short. And Marshall says there's a good reason for that. We must never forget that it is a constitution we are expounding, right? It would have been, in order to make a constitution work, it's actually a good thing that it is relatively short and not all that detailed, because it would have been an unwise attempt, Marshall says, to provide by immutable rules for exigencies. So immutable means unchangeable. So it would be bad for the Constitution to include unchangeable rules for emergencies. That's what exigencies means. Because, if Congress, like the Constitutional Convention, couldn't foresee the kinds of crises that would come in the future, and even if they were foreseen at all, must have been seen dimly, which can best be provided for as they occur. They might not have known whether a bank would be helpful to solve the kinds of emergencies that would occur in the future or not. So they didn't say things one way or the other to keep the option open for Congress to take. Here's another argument about why the lack of detail in the Constitution suggests that a bank is a legitimate exercise of Congress's power. So Marshall says, a constitution to create an accurate detail of all the subdivisions of which its great powers will admit. So in other words, if a constitution lists out in detail every single little thing that is falls under the heading of one of the great powers that is listed. In other words, like let's say like the Constitution says Congress has the power to regulate commerce among the states, and then goes on to say, and by this we mean only these 5 commercial things can Congress regulate in the name of regulating commerce among the states. That would be an example of a constitution containing an accurate detail of all the subdivisions of which its great powers will admit. Is sort of like saying, okay, what we mean here is Congress can regulate commerce by doing only these 5 things. And when they do all those 5 things, they can only use certain strategies by which they can carry those things into execution. Whenever you see the word means It's not like I meant to tell you hello. What they mean, it's a means can be strategy to achieve an end, or what you can also call as a goal. So if you see in judicial opinions means and ends, think of strategies to achieve a goal. If the Constitution contained all the um, like little things that you can do under the heading of one of the powers that is directly listed in Article 1, Section 8, and then also to list all the acceptable strategies by which you can pursue one of these five little things that make up the one thing that is directly listed in the Constitution. That would partake of the prolixity of a legal code. What does that mean? If a constitution contains every single detail, then it is no longer a constitution. It is so detailed that it's like an ordinary code of law. The Constitution is only a couple thousand words long. You can read it very easily. If you were to look at all the laws that are currently on the books that have been created by Congress, you can't read it all. I mean, it's millions and millions of words of law. You don't want that. It could scarcely be embraced by the human mind. You wouldn't be able to understand what makes the Constitution if you had to read through all those millions of words to find out what the Constitution means. So it would never be understood by the public, the meaning of the Constitution. So the nature of a Constitution, instead of containing all the details, and then therefore no one understands what it means because it's just too detailed, a Constitution's nature requires only that its great outlines should be marked. And so just sketch out the goals. Don't list everything, just the most important things. Its important objects designated, and the minor ingredients to help bring those goals into reality, right? Those minor ingredients be deduced from the nature of the objects themselves. In other words, if you're Congress and you want to, do a better job of regulating commerce, can you deduce from a specific commercial problem how a bank would be an acceptable minor ingredient to accomplish a commercial goal? You can deduce the kinds of strategies that Congress can and should use from the nature of the powers listed in the Constitution themselves. So, Congress is kind of in charge of deciding which strategies it wants to use to pursue which goals and powers listed in the Constitution. I want a sense as to what the prolixity of a legal code looks like, right? If you didn't want to look up all the laws that are currently on the books on the internet, if you wanted to have like a physical copy of all the laws that are currently on the books, this is how much shelf space you would need. And I'm actually not sure that this is like all of them. I think there's probably a few more shelves, but I don't know. I guess I shouldn't say for sure one way or the other. No, that is it, because the last volumes here are the indexes. Okay, but that's still a lot. That is a lot of things to be an expert on, right? Whereas the U.S. Constitution is short. People can read it easily. They can try and understand it more easily than they can try to understand and digest all of this. And so here is the conclusion that Marshall reaches. This is a really, really important idea that we're going to be referring to over and over again, especially in the more modern cases, that like 20th century cases that we read. So please make sure that you, saw this passage in the reading, and that you paid attention to what your classmates are saying around this passage. That if you have any questions about this, that you pause the video and ask, because this is a really important concept. Marshall's mind, if Congress has the power to act under the Constitution, it has the power to act successfully. And here's the way he put it: the power being given to Congress, it is in the interest of the nation to facilitate its execution. No one wins if Congress can't bring into reality the kinds of goals that the Constitution allows it to pursue. It can never be in their interest and cannot be presumed to have been their intention to clog and embarrass its execution by withholding the most appropriate means or strategy. So if Congress has the right to act, in like fighting the War of 1812, right? It has the right to act successfully. And if the bank helps Congress fight that war, then that's the kind of strategy that Congress should have the ability to pursue. Right? So if Congress thinks the bank is the best method, is that construction of the Constitution to be preferred, which would render these operations difficult, hazardous, and expensive? So, like, why should a judge strike down the existence of a bank? Because that would be us interpreting the Constitution in a way that would basically make Congress's goals difficult, hazardous, and expensive. That doesn't make any sense for us to interpret the Constitution one way when Congress has come to a different conclusion about the tools it needs to pursue its goals. And so, again, like if it wasn't already clear, the justification for the bank, it isn't that it is part of regular. Well, it's that the bank is a tool by which you can pursue other goals. So it fits into the kinds of things that the necessary and proper clause talks about, unless you talk to the attorneys for Maryland. And so what they try and do is, instead of saying that the necessary and proper clause is an elastic clause, that it stretches the options that Congress has to do things to help the people, Maryland thinks that actually the word necessary means that like absolutely, strictly necessary, right? It's actually a restriction, right? That, is it necessary for your survival as a human if you have less than 3 meals a day? You might think that it's a very good idea to eat 3 meals a day, but is it strictly necessary if you skip a meal and you don't get enough calories? Yeah, for a while you can survive on less than a full diet. Now, is it strictly necessary to ensure that you drink water every day? That is yes, right? You can survive for quite a long time without enough food. You will not be able to survive without water. So Maryland thinks that when you read the necessary and proper clause, you should interpret it in a way that only lets Congress do the things it absolutely must do, in the same way that you absolutely must drink water, even if there are other things that you seem to think are very important, like eating 3 meals a day, but you could kind of survive without it. So Marshall's view is necessary isn't a restrictive word. To employ the means necessary, in other words, to use a necessary strategy to achieve a goal, is generally understood as employing any strategy that you think can produce or achieve that goal. And then he gets like kind of postmodernist in his interpretation of the word necessary, which I think is kind of like cool and weird. He says the word necessary invites all degrees of comparison and is often connected with other words which increase or diminish the impression the mind receives of the urgency it imports. In other words, necessary is an adjective, but oftentimes you have adverbs to describe how necessary something is, right? One thing, a thing may be necessary, like, helpful, very necessary, like very helpful, absolutely necessary, or indispensably necessary, which is the like strictly necessary view that Maryland says. It's like, look, we don't know which version of necessary it is. And, if you want Congress to have the right to succeed, then you should allow it to employ any strategy that it has calculated that is best sort of aimed at achieving the goal. We have a necessary and proper clause. We don't have an absolutely necessary clause. And it's not as though the founders didn't understand the difference between ordinary sort of necessary and something being absolutely necessary, because if you look in Article 1, Section 10, they don't use the word necessary. They prohibit state governments from levying taxes on imported or exported goods, except what may be absolutely necessary for carrying into execution its inspection laws. Now, you don't have to understand what carrying into execution its inspection laws means for the quiz, but if you wanted to geek out, here's a little background. The federal government was so weak back in those days that instead of the federal government being in charge of like looking through cargo that comes into our ports or cargo that is leaving our ports to be sold abroad, state governments were in charge of doing that. So it would be, a state of Maryland official at the port of Baltimore, looking through everything, not a United States government official. And so Maryland can do that, but it can't tax the goods that come in or out of the port of Baltimore, except they could like levy a tax only for the amount of money that is absolutely necessary to pay for its employees who do the inspections at the ports. So the point here is the Constitution uses the word necessary in one place and then absolutely necessary in other places, which suggests that when the word necessary is by itself, it doesn't mean strictly necessary. It means anything that is useful as a strategy to achieve a goal. Right? And then the other point that Marshall makes is if necessary meant absolutely necessary, then why should the necessary and proper clause add the words proper afterwards? Right? Because if something is already absolutely necessary, it's the most indispensable and only indispensable thing, you can't further narrow the choices available to Congress above the thing that is most important, right? So the way he argues it is an extraordinary departure from the usual course of the human mind. In other words, it is we would not be using language in a way that makes any sense. To add a word whose only possible effect of which is to qualify that strict and rigorous meaning, to present to the mind the idea of some choice of means of legislation. In other words, why would you, if the words necessary by itself meant that Congress could only do the things that were absolutely essential, then why would you add on and proper afterwards? Because if you can't make the necessary thing any more strict, then you're at least by adding the words and proper, you're wasting words in the Constitution, right? But the only thing that it could achieve, besides just being two completely unnecessary words, is to convince people that actually something that's necessary and proper is something less than what is absolutely, essentially, strictly necessary. So it just doesn't make any sense to view the necessary and proper clause as the absolutely necessary don't pay attention to the and proper words clause. So, because Marshall is convinced that the necessary and proper clause offers Congress flexibility and not, as Maryland says, inflexibility, Marshall comes up with a test that says, look, it's not as though Congress can do everything under the necessary and proper clause, but it should have plenty of flexibility, and courts should be mindful of that before they strike down laws willy nilly. And so here's the criteria: let the end be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consist with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional. Okay, so let's start with Congress is pursuing some sort of goal that is legitimate, right? So, like, it wants to effectively fight the War of 1812. Legitimate goal, right? Is that goal within the scope of the Constitution? Yeah, the Constitution contemplates the notion that from time to time we're going to have to go to war. All strategies which are appropriate, and is having money flowing through a central bank, a central bank that collects taxes, is that appropriate? Yeah, it helps fight the war. Is it plainly adapted to fighting the war? Yeah, like it's plain to see how having that money flowing helps the government. Is the bank one of the things that is listed in Article 1, Section 9 as among the things Congress cannot do? No, it is not. Does a bank consist with the letter and spirit of the Constitution? Yes, especially if you believe Hamilton's vision of the Constitution. And therefore, since we worked through all of that, who the heck are the judges to say that it's unconstitutional? Congress clearly thinks that what it's doing is important. Congress takes the same oath of office to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. We're going to defer to the decision Congress made and declare what has happened to be consistent with the Constitution. Okay, so in just a second, I'm going to record a new video about the second issue, but I want to go back because if I had to guess, you guys probably are having some trouble with this slide, where Marshall's trying to rebut the notion that the necessary and proper clause should be thought of as an absolutely necessary clause. And honestly, here's the thing. This is probably the most nuanced and linguistically complex argument in the entire case. And so if you're having trouble wrapping your head around this, honestly, that's okay. You don't need to know it for the exams. If you do, great. If you're just keep hitting your head over and over again, and you can't figure it out from rereading it, you can't figure it out from watching the slides or reading your classmates' questions, that's okay. All right, so I'm going to stop here, and then you can do the reading for the first part of the case through issue 1, and then we will reconvene and cover the second issue in just a minute on whether Maryland can tax that bank.